Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Jank Tank, episode number 28. My name is Timothy Zaccanino. I'll be hosting for you today, and I've got both of the boys on the line. Sounds like Teld's getting over a little bit of a sickness. I've still got a little bit myself, but hopefully Chris is coming with his A game today, so he can carry us.
I am getting robot arms all up in me surgically in a week, and I can't sleep on my right shoulder, and I'm still limping.
Oh,
So,
okay. I was like, what do you mean? What?
I've got some abdominal wall issues, and yeah, they were like, "Here's this robot arm we're gonna put inside you." And at first, it was like, "That's kind of freaky. I don't want to think about that." But then I thought about it some more, and I was like, "This is just like so much better than like a human arm being inside of me." So I'll take it.
Sure. Okay, so no A
Yeah.
game from you. So maybe with our
We're
powers
all sick and
combined.
injured. It's the rigors of podcasting are really taking their toll on us,
It
I think.
is like we invest so much into this podcast for you, the listener, and
I definitely didn't scribble the notes for this like 20 minutes
we,
before we
we
started.
we definitely didn't decide on this topic at 8 p.m. last night.
No.
We had a little bit of a little bit of a scare. It wasn't scary, but we had to bring Rome to the hospital over a week ago now for
Oh shit.
I guess it's called croup. I don't know. I'm not going to go into detail, but
Babies have so many weird disease that just have like names that sound like they're from 18th century England.
Yeah, well, he also developed something called Striders, and I was like, you're making that one up. But he started daycare last week, 2 weeks ago, and we went to the pediatrician the day before he started daycare, told him that, hey, kiddo's starting daycare, and he was like, LOL, I'll see you all on Friday then. And we were all like, we all had a hearty laugh about it. Like, ha ha ha, that's a funny pediatrician joke. And then sure enough, our ass is bringing him to the hospital on Friday.
Oh my god.
And he recovered within like 14, 15 hours. We all came home, but we are still like, I am not a person who gets sick, but I've still like getting over this like 10 days later, whatever I picked up from being in the hospital, so not feeling 100% myself, but we're gonna go ahead and troop on through for the listener here because we do this for you. The name of the game today is Control, but before we do that, remember the best way to support Jank Diver Gaming and the Jank Tank podcast is to join our Discord server. Come draft with us and give us your feedback. It's a great place to hang out with like-minded individuals and talk about Cube, Retail Limited, and all things Magic. You can find links to our Discord server wherever you're listening to this podcast. We host tons of scheduled events throughout the week, including our Peasant Cube on Saturday nights, the mainline Jank Diver Cube on Sunday nights, F&M style drafts on Fridays where our players vote on a cube to play, as well as various guest cubes created by members of our servers throughout the week. There's always plenty to do. I think recently, the most recent guest cube that debuted was like a 1,000 card chaos cube that people seem to have a lot of fun with. They drafted it twice. The designer, forgive me, I forget who the designer was, but they got a lot of feedback and made some changes and stuff like that. So always cool to see the guest cubes debut in our server. You can check out our socials on Twitter at JankDiverGaming, YouTube.com/JankDiverGaming, and you can find Teld streaming when he's 100% and not in the middle of teaching in cross country on Twitch.tv/Teld Talks. A couple quick shout outs I wanted to throw out here from some community members. First off, shout out to I believe it's Idonius on YouTube, who caught like this pretty big error in the last episode that we uploaded. Like halfway through the episode, for some reason the intro started playing for about 5 minutes again. And I don't know how that happened, but we were literally talking about like Teferi, like 5 minutes Teferi, and then it's like, hey, it's Timothy here with Jank Diver Game, like for 5 minutes. And it's like, how did that happen, man? So I managed to fix the YouTube version, but if you listen to the podcast on Spotify or Libsyn, that's just going to be in there. That's just an artifact of the episode that I'm not going to deal with. So sorry about that. Thanks to Idonius for pointing that out so I could fix the YouTube version. And then thanks to, I think it's Androphiel, who joined the Discord server and gave us a little bit of feedback on the podcast. And yes, I will say to that user, as well as everybody else listening, that I am continuing to try to get the audio mixing right on these episodes. I am not an audio person, but I understand, Chris, it sounds like you always come over a little bit softer than the rest of us, and I've been trying to adjust that. Maybe unsuccessfully, but it's something I've been working on, and I'm trying to get the audio mixing correct. So thanks for pointing that out again. The feedback's always helpful.
Chris, you just got to start taking after me and just yell into the mic all the time. Make him turn you down.
Not my nature. Well, I'm one of those people, like, I don't know if, like, what's going on with my inner ear, like, fluctuates or what the deal is, but, like, occasionally people will be like, dude, you have to speak up. I can't understand you. And then at other times, my mom will be like, why are you yelling right now? And it's like, it's not consistent. I don't know why that is.
I do generally turn your audio up and Teld's audio down and leave myself the same. That's that's my usual approach to editing.
I would also like to just throw a shout out. The Jank Tank is not sponsored, but we are completely willing to sell out. So if you've got a company and you'd like an ad reading right here, this is the spot.
Mm-hmm. Right here, right now, baby.
Dude, I will sell out for HelloFresh in a heartbeat. Like, I'm not going to eat that shit, but I will talk it up. Like,
you just killed the potential sponsorship right there. You just said, I won't eat that shit. So they're going to, I mean.
That's okay.
All right, maybe not HelloFresh, but.
I will eat that. I will eat it and then talk about how good that they tell me that they think it is.
Dude, they don't listen to the reads. They don't care. You think Raid Shadow Legends is listening to every single Raid Shadow Legends sponsor they put out there? No, they don't care.
They better be.
Maybe they are. I don't know. All right, let's get into the meat of this episode. We're talking about Control today, and I'll let Chris is really going to carry us on this. This is something I think he wanted to talk about a little bit, but we're going to get into a single card discussion here about a Control card and a maybe innocuous Control card. Maybe not the first thing you would think of when you think of a Control card, but the card we're talking about today is Quintorius Loremaster, red-white card. the best blue card in the cube, as Teld likes to call it. It's the best blue card. Yeah. Yep. Teld, I'm going to read Quintorius, and then I'm going to turn this one over to you to talk kind of like how we landed on this card, its development in our cube, and why this is the card we landed on for Control discussion. But Quintorius Loremaster, this is the one from March of the Machine. It's 3 red-white for a 3/5 legendary Elephant Cleric. Elephant Cleric, very important to the card. It has a Vigilance. It says at the beginning of your end step, exile a non-creature, non-land card from your graveyard. Make a 3/2 red and white spirit creature token. This card has so much goddamn text on it. It also has an activated ability for 1 red, white, and tap it. Sacrifice a spirit. Choose a target card exiled with Quintorius. You may cast it without paying its mana cost. And if it would be put into the graveyard, put it on the bottom of its owner's library instead. So you can't loop the same card over and over again. Tell, why is this the best blue card in the cube?
Yes. So one of the reasons, I'm actually going to lead with this despite it not being the best reason with the card, but it is a reason. You actually can loop the card. So it only puts the card back on the bottom of your library if it's a spell. So did you know if you put a Planeswalker into play with this, once the Planeswalker is no longer a spell, it's a permanent, and it goes back to the graveyard.
That's a good point.
So this actually comes up with Chandra 4 and Teferi 5 some. All right, so kind of big picture here is that Quintorius is, as an elephant, elephants travel in herds, and Quintorius brings friends. It's just immediately 6/7 worth of stats if you get to the end step with this card, which don't ever play this card into open removal mana if you can. That's like the one kind of caveat on this card, because if you don't get that first trigger, it's really bad. As most like 5 mana do-nothings are. But once you get that first trigger, you've already gotten some value. The big thing, though, is that with this card, if you untap with it, that second half of the card text about being able to cast your spells is really, really powerful. So this ignores timing. Or no, it doesn't ignore timing, excuse me. Because you ignore the mana cost, and it's 3 mana for anything, you can basically play some really, really powerful sorceries and instants. So blue already has really, really good cards like that. We've got Intrude on the Mind, Sublime Epiphany, you've got Dismiss, you've got Time Warp is the really, really big one. In addition to Planeswalkers and random enchantments that find their way into the graveyard. So this card just basically says if you untap with it, you almost can't lose. Because what ends up happening is you'll like the first turn, you'll take a Planeswalker or a Dismiss or something like that underneath it. And then at some point down the road, you're going to get to just get a huge amount of value off of your opponent. You're going to get a free cast of this spell that costs you 3 mana for like 5 to 6 mana worth of effects. The really, really broken thing about this card, though, is like I mentioned, Time Warp. Some of the things you can do with this card, just like you might as well turn on the circus music where you like cast Quintorius, and then next turn you cast Time Warp, you flash Time Warp out of the graveyard, you take another turn with Quintorius, then on your Quintorius free turn, you copy it with Quintorius, and now you're taking like 2 or 3 extra turns. So basically, this card just snowballs out of control really, really quickly. in terms of generating value every turn and starting to generate a pretty big mana advantage. Because as Vigilance, you can attack with it and then use the spell. So you don't have to choose between actually attacking with it or not. This is the kind of card that even reading it, it doesn't really convey how much of that makes the game warp around it. And what ends up happening with this card, my experience with it has been like, everybody's like, this card looks bad. Why is it in the cube? And then you convince them to play it. Now I had to be convinced myself because I got completely destroyed in a roto by Quintorius looping Teferi Hero of Dominaria, which is how I know about this interaction. My opponent just kept buying it back and I could not get it off the table. But basically people play this card and then they realize like, oh, this is really, really broken when you start flashing back like 4, 5, and 6 mana spells. And sure, you're not going to have too many of those. But that's not even like the floor of the card is this is just a 3/5 that makes 3/2s every single turn and gives you some flexibility because you get to be able to reuse your removal spells, which is like pretty powerful in and of itself. But when you start getting those really expensive spells back, like you flash back and Intrude on the Mind with this card and you just can't lose.
100%. Yeah, I think one of the concerns that people have when they read the card too is that they see the stat line and then they see that it makes the spirit on end step. So like the thought process is like, oh, it doesn't do it when it ETBs. Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, it being on the end step is what makes it repeatable, right? But also like this is the they always have Doomblade fallacy and they always have the mana up fallacy. But like because this does this on your opponent's end step, like sure they can untap and remove it, but most of the time, especially in proactive decks, people are spending most of their mana every turn. So it is going to happen a lot more frequently that it doesn't, that you play this and it just makes it the end step and makes the 3/2, which makes it effectively like doing it on ETB.
Yeah, don't run this into open removal, but people still have a love affair for Scarab God, and this card is substantially better than Scarab God. This card slams the door much harder than Scarab God on average.
Yeah, I mean, I think it can depend, right? Because this, absolutely. Like, if it Scarab God, like, obviously with the 5 power and just being, like, rebuyable to your hand is a different card. But I understand what you're saying insofar as, like, as an inevitability engine, the ceiling on what you can break with Quintorius is a lot higher. And then Scarab God, like, just provides more board presence. So they're different cards, but I take your point.
You know what? It just kind of dawned on me. You know what this feels like? You know, when you call this a control card, it feels like what we used to think control planeswalkers. You know, it's filling the role of what a classic control planeswalker used to be. You know, like you would play these 5 mana walkers that just generate a body every turn, and that was gonna like be your win con. You would back it up with removal and stuff. And like obviously Quintorius dies to creature removal, but we're being honest, a lot of the stuff that kills creatures these days also just kills planeswalkers anyway.
I was going to say that exact thing.
Yeah, so like this is kind of filling that role of like, hey, this is what we used to play these 5 mana planeswalkers to do, is make a body every turn. But this one can't be attacked down like a planeswalker could. It has, you know, instant speed interaction on it, which is better than most planeswalkers. So, like, it's not a direct comparison, but compare this to, like, you know, 5 mana Vivian, which isn't a control card at all. It's a, you know, green beatdown card, but that thing just pumps out a 3/3 every turn and has the potential to draw you extra cards. That's kind of what you're doing with this, though you're trying to do something broken. Like, you don't have to do something broken for this Quintorius to be good. But, like, the upper ceiling is that you're doing something broken, like copying a time warp after casting a time warp.
Yeah.
Right.
The kind of testament to this card's power, I think, is that this card, a non-insignificant portion of the time shows up in 4-color decks where it is the only red or white card in your deck. And it just, you stretched your mana to a 4th color to fit Quintorius into your deck. And, you know, sure, doing that is, like, kind of, it's one of those things of like, man, did you need to do that? And maybe you did, maybe you didn't, but like the card's power speaks for itself. Like once people play this card and they recognize what it's doing on a game, you know, people turn around on it pretty quickly. They go from haters to believers really quickly.
It's one of those cards that just like looks too expensive. And even if the fixing in your cube isn't like we've pushed the fixing as far as we want to push it, in terms of like making it a legitimate cost in draft to go 3 or 4 colors while still having plenty of tools to do that. But, you know, even if like the mana that you're comfortable playing doesn't readily support like a 4-color deck, like Teld mentioned, like a lot of cubes will like play Lightning Helix, and like Lightning Helix isn't even like that much better than like Lightning Strike in Boros. It's like a plant for like here's a good spell for like a Jeskai control deck because the life gain is meaningful. Mm-hmm. As far as like reasons to move into a third color and play a card like this, like I think Quintorius like really fits the bill as like a Jeskai incentive. Although I've seen Teld, I've seen you play it in like more mid-rangey Boros decks that have like bigger spells, bigger creatures that aren't just like going for the throat. But yeah, I mean, if you're playing like a Lightning Helix or like some other card in your Boros section that's specifically designed to be like a reward for going like Jeskai in your blue-white control deck, Quintorius right now, I'm looking at, Quintorius is like 20 cents. So, you know, if you try it and you're like, this is too expensive for my cube or it doesn't fit my design goals or whatever, like you spent 20 cents. So I think it's something worth trying out. It has won itself a lot of converts that were like abject skeptics.
Yeah, I think this card is definitely a card you can play in more of a mid-range shell, but I do think a lot of the card's power, as much as I love it, I do think a lot of it is in that blue space, being able, because just the blue instants and sorceries, the blue planeswalkers are so powerful, even though, you know, specifically to Fairy as far as planeswalkers go, but just those blue cards you're flashing back are cards that take it to 11. But if you just like put it in a Boros deck and you've got some cheap interaction, you know, maybe a winning announcement in case it goes to the graveyard or something like that, a Chandra. You've got a couple of things floating around with some cheap removal. The big thing is you don't ever want to play Quintorius and not have a card in the graveyard. So a lot of Boros decks that in the traditional space where they're playing a lot of creatures are not going to be able to utilize it because you're not guaranteed to have a card in the graveyard for this by turn 5. And if you don't have that reliably, it is quite bad. So you want to have a lot of 1 to 2 mana removal spells in your deck.
Yeah. But even in like a big, I mean, I've never seen it show up there in RQ, but like, let's say you're playing like a big Naya deck, right? Like, even if you just have like a collection of red and white removal, and then you've got like Chandra 4, Nissa 5, maybe you have Elspeth Sun's Champion at the top. The fact that this is just non-land, or non-creature, non-land, and not instant or sorcery, like if you have a couple of really impactful planeswalkers and like a suite of like 3 or 4 removal spells, this can still just be pretty good.
Yeah, that sounds really fun. Actually, I've never thought about this in the Naya space, but that sounds kind of cool. Like to play all the powerful green.
Best green card in the cube, Quintorius.
I'll get back to you on that one.
My favorite interaction with this is that you can sacrifice the tokens from Clarion Spirit to activate the ability, which is I've seen that happen like exactly one time.
I do miss Clarion Spirit since we cut it.
Yeah,
but...
I did need to mention because I was told I had to do this. I think I may have said this earlier. I was one of the people who was the most down on Quintorius when we first put it in the cube. You know, I was actually kind of against testing it. I thought it was a little silly because I was like, this is not going to be a good Boros card. And it turns out I don't actually think this is a particularly great Boros card. So maybe in that regard I was right, but this is definitely a Tim suggestion that is held up.
Yeah, this is the rare W for Tim here. Where honestly, when I pitched this card in March of the Machine, I was like, isn't 6-7 worth of stats for 5 mana across 2 bodies just good? Like I did not pay any attention to the activated ability. Like obviously it was one of those, if you can do this, you can do this thing. But I was like, isn't that just good stats for this cost? And I think, like, if I remember correctly, Teld was down on it. Chris was kind of like, I could take it or leave it. And then, like, we've kind of flip-flopped to the point where I'm like, man, can we cut Quintorius for a different Boros card? But I recognize it as really powerful, and Teld's obviously a huge advocate of it. So I'll give myself the dub. I'm not opposed to giving myself the dub when I get it, you know?
Yeah, man.
It doesn't happen that often.
Yeah. I think the big thing that Quintorius has kind of a lead in for the next section is that Quintorius doesn't play particularly well with Rads. You don't really want to be you want to be playing a lot of cheap interaction when you're playing Quintorius. And so I think that's another thing is I think we're going to talk about this, but it plays well in the current shells we're seeing of Control.
I could see this actually being good with that new Wrath that came out, the one that you can gift a card.
Oh yeah. Okay, that one specifically is probably really good. Yeah.
Okay, now it's a test. Now it's a test. We're into it now.
Yeah, we're not finagling the cube to make that happen. Okay, so we're going to move into a discussion here about the not just Control in general, but how Control has kind of changed historically from classical, traditional Control to where it's at now. A lot of this context is going to come from our own cube, but I think we're going to frame this as kind of a historical take. Like, this is just what's happening with Control in general across Magic. I thought, since we're talking about Control and most people equate Control, equals counterspells, anytime someone disagrees with a statement on this podcast episode, the other people are just going to yell the word counterspell really, really loudly. So if you say something that I don't like, I'm just going to go counterspell, counter that.
Okay.
But Chris, I'm going to go ahead and throw this to you to kind of introduce us to the topic, walk us through it, kind of like why this is something that you wanted to talk about, and maybe talk a little bit about the state of control in R Cube, which we've done a couple times on this podcast. I think our like second
we talked about
episode.
blue. Yeah, we talked about blue.
Yeah, it's definitely changed over the course of like the 6 months to a year of episodes that we've put in between now and that blue episode.
Okay, so also I'm just gonna let you guys know because I scribbled up the notes. I know in our last episode I basically kind of shut down and really didn't have anything to say in the second half of the last episode, so I'm gonna make up for it this time by talking way too much. Okay, so this is not gonna be an episode, detailing like
counterspell. Nope. I don't see. Nobody likes control, man. See, nobody. Okay,
you just played counterspell though, so
No, control players don't like playing control. That's not how.
What do you, dude? I mean,
I know that's not a true statement. I know that's
it's
the most false statement in the world. All right,
I'm sorry. Our enjoyment, sir.
I wouldn't actually. The style of blue I like to play pisses people off even more. Because I'm not just like counterspelling all of your shit until I land like something that can kill you. Like I'm sneaking in like a 2/1 flyer early on in between counterspells and like beating you to death with it over the course of like 8 turns. And I think people like that even less.
I got a little bit of a story about that, but I'll save it for later. Sorry to interrupt. Okay. I promise I'm not going to do that more than that one time. Go on.
This episode is not going to be like because a lot of shows have done this episode, and I think it's like a fine episode topic, but it's just because it's been done a lot, it's not what we're going to be doing here today. What we're not going to be doing is like doing a primer on like how control works in Cube. What we're actually going to be talking about is how we've noticed that like the dynamics of a control deck in our Cube have changed. And I know like it's kind of a meme at this point that like in every episode we sneak in an opportunity to be like, oh man, blue's so much better than it used to be. This is not going to be blue is so much better, the episode where we talk about like controls dynamics are changing because of the quality of blueprints. What we're going to be talking about is kind of the adaptations that have been happening naturally in the ways that our players design their control decks, and by extension making those control decks more successful. And I'm going to go out on a limb here that if you're playing a quote-unquote fair cube, this probably is going to apply to your cube too. And one of the reasons that I wanted to do this episode is if you are not cubing your cube as frequently as we are, which is to say a lot, and you don't play constructed ever because, pure control decks don't really exist in pack limited, your control decks might feel like they're slipping. And you might not be getting enough play feedback to really understand why. So if you're feeling that way, you're like, man, my control decks just don't feel as good as they used to, but you're not getting enough reps to really like identify the problem, then this episode might be really helpful for you. So this first segment is one that I call New Pressure's Old Plan. And the old control plan, as it was conceived of and constructed, and by extension Cube, the classic plan is you just run your opponent completely out of resources by just playing answers, and then like you quote unquote finish the game with a ham sandwich. Usually that ham sandwich is going to be like a 6-mana play. And I know that a lot of people still have this mentality because we're not playing the card. What is it called? Stoic Sphinx. Is that the card that we cut? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm actually going to plug that card if you don't have a problem with its power level in this episode, because I think it perfectly encapsulates what we're talking about here. I posted Stoic Sphinx to Reddit, and someone responded, this looks like a powerful card, but I don't have a blue beatdown deck. So there's no space for it, and there's quote-unquote better control finishers.
It turns out there's really not.
There's not. There's really not.
Well, that's the 4-mana 5/3 flash has hexproof if you haven't cast a spell this turn. Flying. Sorry, it has flying. That's important.
It has flying. That's important. Side note, you probably don't have a better control finisher in your cube, and you might not realize it. So New Pressure's Old Plan. So here's the thing. Proactive decks have faster clocks than they used to. They make more battlefield material, like everything makes tokens now for some reason, so 1-for-1 removal is not keeping you as safe as it used to. there are a lot more Mull Slayer type cards where they will kill you, but they also generate some kind of ETB advantage, which means, they're obviously like trading up a little bit on value on your removal spells. There are a lot more direct answers to walkers. I think the old plan of answer everything, play a planeswalker used to basically be like, game over. But it is now possible to exhaust your hand of removal spells and counter spells and then play Teferi onto an open board, and your opponent just hits it with like any number of the black or white removal spells, or burn if you minus your planeswalker, which makes your planeswalkers just not as insulated to not being answerable on an empty board as it used to be. That's just the case.
Or haste too.
Or haste, yeah. And then the other thing is, and I used to be annoyed by this design change that they made, but like I understand why they did. I think it was partially driven by Commander, but also people just don't like not playing the game anymore because they're out of resources. There are, like, across the color pie, numerous ways to generate card advantage now, which makes the running your opponent out of resources plan just a lot less viable. And sort of the new way that we've noticed that our control decks are shifting towards is like our control decks are beating their opponents while their opponents are still holding cards. That used to just not be the case as much. Your opponent's like top decking and that's why you win. Our control decks have adapted to the speed of contemporary Magic to the extent that like you'll kill your opponent and they're still holding like 3 cards. And that just didn't used to be the case. So essentially the biggest shift is the control decks are playing less interaction, and they're playing more threats. And that doesn't mean they're playing more finishers. I would not advocate for, like, cutting cheap removal in order to play, like, your 4th 5-drop, right? What we're talking about are cards like, and I'm actually going to read the cards because we're not, typically that good at it. We're talking about 3 drops, mostly, actually, because you almost always want to interact on 2. Like, very few control decks are going to be playing threats on 2 that are worth letting your opponent, like, resolve Luminarch Aspirant on 2. But on turn 3, especially if you're on the play, some good proactive options are, like, Sphalan of Sea and Sky, which is 1 blue for a legendary Merfolk God. It's a 3/4. It has indestructible as long as you control at least 2 other merfolk. That's the line of text that made us overlook this card at first, because in most cubes it really does not matter. This is not a merfolk tribal card. Whenever it attacks, you draw a card, and then other merfolk you control have ward 1, yada, yada, yada. But basically what this is this is an excellent blue, like, tempo creature. If you can resolve it at essentially board parity, and then you can untap, and you can kind of maintain that board parity, so it's not getting shut down in combat. Once it's attacked and drawn a card, you're doing well. Once you've attacked with it twice and drawn 2 cards, you are in really, really good shape, right? It's at that point, it's a 3/4 with a divination tacked onto it, which is pretty crazy. And the other card, which actually I'm going to have to look up because we cut it for being obnoxious, Chrome Host Seed Shark. One thing I want to shout out is Andy, Lucky Paper. You probably don't listen to our podcast, but in the event that you catch this episode, I think you really undervalue this card. Chrome Host Seed Shark is 2 and a blue for a 2/4 flyer, so it is a solid blocker, which really takes the... If this was like a 2/3, it would be a lot more painful, but because it's a 2/4, it's going to block most of your opponent's potential, like, 2-mana plays, which really makes a difference in terms of, like, the tempo that you're sacrificing here. And then whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you incubate X, where X is that spell's mana value. We've talked about this card before. Essentially what it does is, even if you're casting, like, relatively small, like, let's say you're casting a 2-mana non-creature spell, like a counterspell, it's still basically turning your counterspell into counter-target spell, draw a bear with haste. And if you follow this up with, like, a Jace the Mind Sculptor, then it turned Jace the Mind Sculptor into Jace with a 2/4 flying blocker in front of it that drew a 2-mana 4/4 with haste, which is fucking
And
crazy.
Flash.
And Flash, yeah. So Elite Spellbinder is something else that's actually pretty good to play on turn 3 in a control deck, because you can often disrupt your opponent's turn 3 play, which is insane, because now you have a clock, and the tempo that you, or the going shields down on turn 3 gets mitigated by the fact that, like, even if they have a second turn 3 play, you're just going to get rid of the one that affects you the most.
I was just going to hop in here for just a second and say a common criticism of Elite Spellbinder has been that, you tag your opponent's 3-drop or 4-drop, but they just play the other 3 or 4-drop in their hand. And while I think that's fair in some cases, first of all, that doesn't happen every time. People drastically oversell how often that happens. And then two, right, when you're playing in a more controlling game plan, you've got answers in your hand. A lot of times the difference between your opponent's best threat coming down and your opponent's second best threat coming down, you can kind of sculpt it based on what's in your hand to play around it. So Spellbinder gets a lot stronger when you got access, at least this part of Spellbinder becomes a lot stronger when you got access to the answers in your hand, so you can let your opponent resolve a threat that you don't care about. And now you've got the Spellbinder in play, they can't get that card in play, and it's coming. Plus hand information with good players is obviously incredibly broken.
Yeah, you just said the thing I was going to say, which is on top of it, you get the hand information. And I think hand information is good regardless of what you're playing, but hand information I think is at its best in control decks, because sometimes you have to choose whether or not to counter something without knowing what else you might let slip through. And if you can see their hand, it's like, okay, I don't want to let you have that Rekindling Phoenix, but I see that Chandra is also in your hand, so I'm going to let you have that, because I know that if I don't let you have that, then I am going to let you have Chandra, and that's going to be way more of a problem. So you'll notice these are all 3-drops. A pattern that's kind of emerging in the way that these control decks are playing, and I think it is an adaptation that's happening for a couple of reasons. First of all, they keep printing good blue 3-drops. That's thing number one. Thing number two is that the game has sped up. So when our blue decks were bad, it was often because you're just trying to 1-for-1 until you draw a finisher. And the fact of the matter is that you're just going to get overwhelmed if you try to do that. Basically anything that's going to resolve on their end is going to be potentially game winning if you don't have a board presence of any kind. So really leaning on the I'm going to answer everything plan is just not as effective as it used to be. So when you develop something relatively early yourself that has the potential to really run away with the game on its own, and then you just continue to support that with control effects, what that can allow you to do, and people get really frustrated when this happens to them, right? Which is understandable, but people are just not accustomed to the control deck flipping the advantage on the table this early. And if you successfully flip the advantage on the table on turn 3 as a control deck, playing reactively when you're already ahead is so much more powerful than playing reactive when you're behind or at parity. Because then you actually have something going on board that can run away with the game. Cryptic Code is another example. Teld, if you want to talk about that one a little bit.
Yeah, so that's the artifact from MKM that's 2 and a blue, and it ETBs you... What do we call it? Which
Cloak.
one? Cloak. Thank you. So you get the 2/2 ward morph. The equipped creature gets +1/+0 and is unblockable. And you can return Cryptic Coat to your hand for 1 and a blue. And if the morphed card or cloaked card is a creature, you can pay its mana cost to flip it face up. So this doesn't generate an immediate snowbally advantage, but it does create a steady source of pressure, and you can trade off the 3/2 that you've got. You can just block with it, and then the coat will sit there and play, and you can't equip the coat normally, but you can pay that bounce effect at instant speed, put it back in your hand at the end of turn, replay it, cloak again. So it lets you generate a steady stream of 3/2 attackers. Obviously, if you ever hit something that's, a lock wheel or something that's a big creature that you'll have just randomly floating in your deck, it can be a very quick clock. But most of the time, this is just a good grindy source of either blockers that can trade or a steady stream of 3/2 attackers to kind of leverage your removal. And so you have to play the game for a shorter period of time because, if you hit 3 or 4 times with a Cryptic Coat, your opponent's going to suddenly be at, 8 or 11 or something like that, and now they're in range to just die to the random Malcolm you have in play and things like that. Another thing to mention is all these sort of cheap creatures that we're talking about. You don't play a ton of them, but the fact that you're playing 6 or 7 cheap creatures means now that you could have the ability to have multiple of them in play. And one of the problems with control has been that you would be able to not get super far ahead sometimes, right? If you're depending on how your hand rolled out, if your opponent stumbled, you might be 1 mana ahead. But if your hand was just a bunch of counter magic, that might not matter. But
Right.
sometimes it just didn't matter, and your opponent would just play their cards, and then you would flood a little bit and die. But when you're deploying 2 and 3 drops and getting onto the board, and you're using your mana while your opponent's stumbling, now you're able to actually leverage that function of the game where your opponent doesn't get to play the game, and you can get really, really far ahead. And I think that's a notable feature of these decks.
100%. Yeah, Magic happens on the board these days. They just keep pushing the power level of cards that hit the board. Notably, creatures is where a lot of the most powerful designs are these days. Magic is happening on the board, and you just can't afford in a control deck like you used to not have anything going on board. Cryptic Code is also, just to build on what was Teld was saying, is an awesome example because it can be that you play Cryptic Code on 3. It's difficult to remove at a decent rate. It's unblockable. So it can serve as one of those things I was talking about a minute ago, which is like a 3-drop that you can end up riding to victory at while protecting it with control effects after that one turn. But in addition to that, like if you draw it later or if the creature dies early and it's just sitting on board, it turns into a grindy finisher later that's not like an impressive grindy finisher, but it can be your I'm taking the initiative in the game card, or it can be your late game ham sandwich. It can do both of those things. So yeah, just a good card for these type of decks, which I think a lot of us, myself included, when I first read the card, interpret as a tempo card, but it's really like a tempo card and a grind card at the same time.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to mention real quick about the 3-drops in particular, cards like Svalin, Chrome Host, Seed Shark, like these kind of script flipped in cards rather, like, oh, I'm going to start attacking you now type blue cards, is not only are they like good things to just play on turn 3, like you can play Svalin on turn 3 and effectively like that kind of invalidates your opponent's 3/3 or 2/2s or whatever, but they also make for better plays past turn 3 as well than something like, a Torrential Gear Hulk on 6. Torrential Gear Hulk on 6 is like, that's going to be my one play on 6. But on 3, you can go Svalin plus big counterspell, or Chrome Host Seed Shark plus big counterspell. In fact, like, turn 4 might even be the sweet spot for these cards if you're holding something like a Spell Pierce. In fact, Svalin plus Spell Pierce is like one of the safest plays you can make, because you're going to be stable on the board and you're going to have the interaction to trick their interaction. Right. So like these threats being cheaper is not only good for curve purposes, like I can play my 3-drop on 3, but also double spell purposes later on.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and one I didn't even think of. But sometimes if you have one of these in your opening hand, or if you draw it later, like sometimes rather than tapping out for like a sorcery speed finisher on 5, it might be a better play to just like play a Chrome Host Seed Shark and then hold up a counterspell, right? If you've managed to control the game up to that point where you're at the very least at parity. So that's an excellent point, which actually, Tim, thank you for mentioning that, because it segues nicely into what I was going to mention next, which is quote unquote finishers. So part of the problem with modern, what are traditionally considered control finishers at sorcery speed, it's a couple things. Because board commitment plays are better than they used to be, tapping out on turn 5 if your opponent has any resources available is just not as safe as it used to be, because there's more planeswalker removal if you're trying to leverage a planeswalker with an empty board. That's just not nearly as safe as it used to be. And 2, if you tap out for 5 mana, or 6 for a control finisher, if your opponent has any resources left, there's a decent chance that while you're tapped out, they're going to be able to do like 5 mana worth of stuff that's equivalently powerful. Because these, like, in other colors, the expensive creatures have been getting pushed a lot, but in blue, the sorcery speed tap out finisher style cards have really not been getting pushed as hard. So their relative power level to what your opponent's proactive deck can do in response is just not what it used to be. So there's the combination of these sort of like 3 mana quote unquote finishers are more like mid-rangey snowbally cards, and the fact that sorcery speed finishers, like expensive finishers, are just not, they're starting to age relative to the average power level of printed Magic cards, is that when you have more 3-drop cards that can win the game, and you play a couple of flash speed finishers, I'd recommend your finishers in blue be flashy, like Torrential Gear Hulk, like Horned Lock Whale, like Stoic Sphinx, which I'm going to expound on a little bit in a minute. But when you have a better threat density in your control deck, but you still have enough interaction to control the game, you're just not as soft to like, okay, here's like the one finisher that I drew in the top 12 cards of my deck because I'm only playing 3 or 4, and it gets answered, because then you're kind of dead in the water, right? And then you have to go back to the plan of 1-for-1 interacting, and you're just vulnerable. So having more ways to win the game in your control deck is actually a good thing, because you're more resilient to getting blown out.
Yeah, one thing we're seeing is that most of the decks, I'm kind of looking through these like blue heavy decks that have been doing well, and, you know, they're not running, as you mentioned, as many as they used to. We're seeing like 1 to 2 kind of expensive spells in a lot of these decks. And some of them play a few more and kind of got away with it when we were in more controlling metas or like grindier metas. But on average, it looks like they're playing, you know, 1 to 2 5-drops, and sometimes they're playing a 6, but usually the 6 looks something like Horned Lockwhale that's actually a 2-drop.
Or Grave Titan.
Yeah, or Grave Titan.
Yeah.
Grave Titan's is still a great card for closing out the game. But I think the important thing here is it's better to have like 1 or 2 really powerful threats that stick, and that those cheaper cards help clear the way for, rather than put like 4 or 5 expensive finishers in your deck and hope to survive long enough to resolve them.
That's a really good point. Like if I play a 3-drop in my control deck that you feel compelled to answer because it generates cascading advantage and you have to remove it, then that's going to make it a lot more likely that my Teferi or my Scarab God or something like that is going to end up sticking. So one card I mentioned earlier that I want to highlight here, you know, again, not to like, you know, say that this person's opinion is invalid, more that I just think it's like a little bit, it's based on like old heuristics of Stoic Sphinx, just to mention what it does again. 4 mana, 5/3 flyer with flash, and it has hexproof if you haven't cast a spell this turn. What makes this card so insane in control decks is you get to it early at 4 mana, right? Getting to 4 is a lot more consistent than getting to 5, like on curve in general. It just is. And what makes it so powerful is obviously like the flash. So if you do something on 4 that I like, because Stoic Sphinx has 5 power, like there are a lot more spots where your opponent is going to play a 4-drop, and you go, I can outrace that, because I'm clocking you in 4 turns. I can outrace that. You can obviously counterspell it if it's something crazy, right? And you just like hold your Stoic Sphinx. But if I flash in, you know, a 5-power creature with flying after evaluating your play on turn 4, and then I just don't tap out on your turn, I'm going to force you to do 1 or 2 things. I'm going to force you to play a smaller proactive play to try to fish my counter, which again, I might not even spend because it might be something that you still can't race me with, and then follow that up with some kind of Doomblade effect because I cast a spell that turn. Sometimes your hand is not going to have the texture where you can even do that. And if I've applied any pressure at all early, then this is like a 3-turn clock. And if I haven't, even in the absence of having already done some damage, it's a 4-turn clock, which is crazy, right? That comes down on turn 4. So yeah, just throwing it out there, like if you haven't tried Stoic Sphinx in your blue section, it's really good in aggro control, and it's really good in control too.
The thing with Stoic Sphinx too that I don't think people appreciate is, true, like we actually do kind of have a blue beatdown-ish deck in our queue, but a lot of people were like, yeah, I don't support blue beatdown was the common sentiment, but
right.
But it just doesn't matter, because Stoic Sphinx is the beatdown plan. It makes its own beatdown plan because it is really hard to describe until you've seen it in play how difficult this thing is to race or interact with at all. To the point that I actually think one of the biggest skill checks on the card was, if your opponent is tapped out, do you sorcery speed this? Because every time I personally cast the card, it was at sorcery speed.
Yeah, it's just a 4 mana 5/3 hexproof flyer at that point. Like, that's worth tapping out for.
The naysayers get caught up a little bit on this is blue card with 5/3 stat line, which is just a non-traditional stat line for like a blue flyer, right? Whereas, you know, if you printed this card with a 0 power, but it said tap, deal 5 to your opponent, people would be like, oh, like, look at this control card, you know?
Yeah.
So it's just like a cognitive thing where it just does not look like a control card. Like, it does, if you physically look at the stat line on the card, it does not scream control card, but it plays the control role very, very well. It's just your clock, right? Your control deck needs the clock at some point. Like, sometimes, like Chris said, it's a ham sandwich. It's a 2/2 that's attacking 10 turns in a row. This one just happens to be a 4-turn clock, and like, yeah, it doesn't matter that it's a 5/3 on a blue creature, which questionable that they printed that.
Weird.
But yeah, this is a control finisher, for sure.
Yeah, The other thing too is a lot of times the play around this card is like you're trying to bait your opponent, but to bait them and have the removal spell available too, you had to play a small creature that doesn't outrace the Sphinx, and you just don't get you just don't respond to it.
Yeah,
and now and then you do play a big creature. Let's say you do that, right? You play your big creature. Well, now you're tapped out, and they just use their interaction anyways. It's very, very difficult if you're remotely at parity when this card comes down to ever have any shot of racing it. Like, we watched games that we cut it after about 2 weeks. I think it made it. The first time we saw it was in the Bant deck that we like to talk about, that was just like an aggro control deck, and it was just killing people out of nowhere, just straight up soloing games. And then it showed up in some actual control decks where it did the same thing. It just did it by itself. Didn't need any support. You just like, you'd be playing against your green opponent, and they'd like resolve some random 3 or 4 drop, and then you'd be like, okay, Stoic Sphinx. Good luck, sir.
And also, to be clear, like, I don't think it depends on the power level of your cube. I think if you're trying to power max a fair cube, if you are trying to play a blue quote unquote beatdown deck, it should still be a counterspell deck. And I just think Stoic Sphinx is a crazy clock in any counterspell deck. So if you haven't tried it, just give it a shot. I don't think it's ever seen like any standard play, right? So I mean, it's got to be cheap. Okay, so Stoic Sphinx is 50 cents. So if you don't believe me, just spend 50 cents and try it, and I think you'll be a believer.
Well, would you actually advise people in cubes like ours to actually play the card? Like,
no. I'm just saying, if you are a doubter and you want to test our ability to evaluate.
Okay, sure.
If you want to give if you want your people at your pod to have a really, really bad time, and you're a malicious person, go buy that.
You're now at 75 cents for a copy of Quintorius Lore Master and a copy of Stoic Sphinx. So let's see how big we can get that tab up today.
Yeah, I think if you try this in, again, like a fair cube, like blue is often focused on doing unfair things in like vintage cube, in which case, like, I wouldn't recommend this as much. But yeah, like, I think you'll go from like, I don't understand why you would ever want to play this card, to the first person that lost to it is like, this thing has hexproof and I hate it. It sucks.
Well, let me ask you one of these. What's the role of these big finishers nowadays? Like, what's the role of something like a Gear Hulk or a Shipbreaker Kraken or whatever it's called? I mean, for us, we play Sublime Epiphany, we play Torrential Gear Hulk as kind of the big 6-mana finishers, and then, like you've mentioned, Hornlock Whale and Shark Typhoon are like kind of secretly lower down the curve, so they don't count. But like, do you think it's important to have a big finisher like that if our blue control decks are starting to turn the script on turn 3 or 4? Like, could we, like, I don't think any of us want to cut Torrential Gear Hulk. We're still playing it.
No, it's still great.
Like, do you think that they're just not necessities? Like, do you think if we did cut Gear Hulk, we'd be losing something?
So Gear Hulk specifically is in an interesting spot because it has Flash, which automatically raises the kind of playability factor of it, and it also impacts something the turn it comes down. I think in modern Magic, I don't know in a cube setting why you would want to run Hullbreaker Kraken. That card is
that one. Not
I don't actually. I don't actually think
Hullbreaker Horror.
Hullbreaker Horror. Yes.
I don't actually think that card is as good as we thought it was initially, but also it's just a really miserable card to play against. But I will say there's a certain element of reliability to it. Like, once that card comes down and you've got the mana to cast another spell, you can't lose, right? Or rather, you can't kill it. Your opponent has to, targets it with a removal spell, you bounce it back to hand, you keep playing the game, assuming you don't just randomly die. These cards are like Scarab God for, I know I poo-pooed it a little bit earlier, but that card is, if you don't have exile-based removal, is going to keep coming back. There's a reliability to it that these other cards don't have. Svalin, is just a 3-drop, right? It dies to a lot of removal spells. And so there's that factor of it doesn't have the sort of guaranteed big game impact that a Grave Titan or that a Scarab God is going to have if you're able to get into those spots. I just think the biggest thing is reducing the number of them. So I think it used to be that control decks wanted to just play a bunch of rats and a bunch of big finishers. And now I think that you want to play 1, 2, maybe 3 big finishers total. And when you start getting into cards like Sublime, they're sort of pulling double duty, because Sublime is kind of your big finisher, but it's also a piece of interaction, even if it's ridiculously expensive.
Right. And Gear Hulk can also just be like big thing interaction as well, right? Like one of the things that's just makes it so backbreaking is like flash and counterspell. Here's my 5/6, your thing's not happening. I think one thing to note that is important is that all of these cards that we're talking about that we think are still good enough, they all have flash. Every single one of them. And I can't emphasize enough how we've like repeatedly learned the lesson that unless it's cheap, your blue finisher type cards, you want them to have flash. Like, you want to be able to decide if you need to interact or you can take the initiative, right? Flash is fucking huge. Another thing I'll point out is that like a lot of these blue finisher style cards we're talking about, they're a little bit older, which is kind of something I wanted to point to as far as like the 3-drops. The 3-drop slot, regardless of color, really seems to be like a slot where they're pushing power, and I guess maybe they want to move the game in the direction of like the stuff that will end the game is coming out a little faster. But yeah, I think that these are still good. Tim, to address your question, I don't think that they're super necessary anymore. I think you still want to have a couple. But the other nice thing about them is, like, if I'm playing an aggro control deck, I probably don't want to go up to 6. That's not really my plan, so I won't take it. And they're still good in control decks. So, like, Torrential Gearhulk is, like, something that our control decks are generally going to get their hands on because no other style of deck than, like, a bigger blue control deck is really going to want to play it. So I think that it has value there in terms of, like, giving your control decks powerful cards that they're generally going to end up with. Especially a card like Gearhulk, because, like, it just, you're not really going to play it in your Simic decks. Right? You could play it in like your multicolor big mid-range deck, but it doesn't really fit as cleanly there as going for like an Inferno Titan or something like that. So it provides a powerful card that your control deck is generally going to get access to. So I think it has some value there.
All of this seems to come from one place that I've pointed out, I feel like, and I wanted to get your opinion. Do you feel like this is sort of all a symptom of the fact that outside of a handful of very specific wraths, they're mostly just kind of bad these days? I think the move from big finishers to playing lots of cheaper spells, do you think, how much of that do you think is tied to the fact that spending 4 mana to sweep the board is just not a great deal in a bunch of matchups now? Because it used to be that you would interact once or so before turn 4, you'd wrath, and then you'd play your big 5 mana finisher, and that was kind of the play patterns we expected from control. But a lot of that was hinged on the fact that the wrath got you back up to parity, right? And that is not necessarily true. So I guess I was just kind of wondering like what your thoughts on, because I've been pushing the 1-for-1 removal game for quite a while now, and that plays really well with what we're talking about, because everything we've mentioned are cards that play poorly with wraths and play really well with spot removal.
Well, that actually dovetails really well, because the next section that I wanted to do is interaction, and Teld has been saying for a little while now that wraths are just not that good. So, Teld, I feel like this is a good place for you to talk about why we feel pretty strongly that at least the traditional 4-mana wraths are starting to fall off.
Yeah, so I mean, we've mentioned more and more cards are generating value very, very cheaply. More and more cards are really resilient. So I think the biggest thing is that if you look at our cube, the value you get as you go up for each mana spent becomes increasingly higher. So the problem with wraths now is that when you spend your 4-mana wrath, you clear out the opponent's cards that they spent their early game mana on. But now they play a 4-mana card or a 5-mana card that wins the game. And you aren't in a position to keep it from resolving or to immediately kill it. And so because you didn't do that, a lot of times it now generates some value on top of that. So turn 4 in particular is just a really, really bad turn to try and wrath. It's a really bad turn to be tapping out in your control deck. Turn 3 was relatively safe because most of those cards don't have that sort of same immediate game-ending threat. So you could resolve something there, but turn 4 is very, very dangerous. And so I think outside of one very, very specific wrath, I think for the most part, they're kind of falling off. And that one wrath is Sunfall, which is one of the most broken cards ever printed.
It's your wrath and your finisher on the same card.
Yeah, in addition, Exile cleans up everything. It removes a lot of the counterplay to wraths, which is like... just like
Realm Breaker Giant.
Yeah, it's exactly like that terrible card that everybody freaked out about.
But yeah, Sunfall is just, it cleans out all of the graveyard synergy cards too, which is really big. Like you can't buy back, like a lot of times like your blacks, like we don't do it as much anymore, but it used to be you'd have a bunch of like those little black recursive dorks. And your opponent could Sunfall and just everything got cleaned out. Your Sarah Paragon didn't work because all your creatures got exiled. Just, it does literally everything on top of giving you a very cheap, very efficient threat.
I would like to throw Farewell on that list as well. Because Farewell's not as broken as Sunfall, but it is like the type of card that when it resolves, like, it can very much decide game. The only difference there is like 6-mana Wrath. Sometimes you don't get to 6 mana if you're relying on the Wrath to catch you up. So Sunfall is clearly more egregious than Farewell, but I do think Farewell deserves a shout there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just basically the short of it is that it's very, very easy for your opponent to rebuild, and the turn that Wraths come down in current Magic is such that it's a very, very risky turn in a reactive deck to give your opponent. Whereas, for example, if on turn 4 or 5, instead of casting a threat, you just held up Dismiss, right? And you took your opponent's hit, you let them hit you for, 4 or 5 or whatever. And then you dismiss their 4-drop, and now we untap and we play our land, we play a 2 or a 3-drop to block, and now we've got a removal spell held up. We're just in a much more favorable position because we're continually able to jockey onto the board and keep competing with the cards our opponent are spending mana on. Especially considering most counter spells are going to create a huge tempo advantage against more expensive spells, and those expensive spells resolving is how your opponent's going to beat your control deck, right? Like, I guess the 1-for-1 removal plus snowbally stuff is the more reliable game plan, where, you interact on 2, resolve something on 3, interact on 4, interact on 5, play something, interact on 6, play something. Like, that's a much more consistent game plan because you're stymieing your opponent over a larger period of time where they have access to more mana, right? Where they can play bigger, more threatening cards. Because if you let just hypothetically, if you tap out and you let a Grave Titan resolve, how do you beat that as a control deck most of the time? Like, maybe
Second Wrath.
Yeah.
Second
yeah. And so Wraths still have their purpose. There's a reason we run a number of them, but I do think they're really more situational role players rather than the bread and butter of control decks at this point.
So one of the issues with Wraths is, as the person playing against the control player, not the control player, but the control player's opponent, what you really want to do is get your opponent into a position where they have to play at sorcery speed. Like, because then you just don't have to mess with the counter spells and stuff like that, and you know that you have more certainty with your own game plan. So if you can follow up your opponent's control Wrath by just putting more material on board and making that a problem, now they have to start answering your stuff at sorcery speed, and you're the one who's flipped the script. Actually, you didn't flip the script at all. The control player kind of forced themselves into a position where they flipped the script on themselves, and now they're playing at sorcery speed, which is not the position you want to be in as the control player, though. Like, the board wipe is often the type of card that is the only card that's going to get you out of those fast starts that an aggro player had or something like that. So it's a little bit of a catch-22 there. It's why a card like Settle the Wreckage is as powerful as it is. There aren't a lot of instant speed Wraths. In fact, I can't even really think of another one that's playable. Like, maybe there's one or two that's playable that's like more expensive, but
we tried the one from OTJ, and nobody wanted to touch that with the 10-foot pole.
Sure, yeah, the Spree one, right? And again, that's just too expensive. But, like, I don't know, like, do you think they could print 4 mana, 2 white, destroy all creatures, instant speed? Probably
that would
right?
be very strong.
Yeah, that's like too much. So, like, the Wraths have found themselves in a really awkward spot. This is why you called it the Sunfall conundrum in the notes here, is because, like, Wraths need to be Sunfall level to be, like, highly competitive. But then you have Sunfall level cards in your cube, which is
right.
like there seems to be no middle ground between Wrath of God and Sunfall, unfortunately.
I'd be a little bit more okay with Sunfall if, like, the incubate token that it made was like half the number of creatures rounded down or something.
Sure, or just a static 3/3 or something.
Or like a static 3/3 or like a static bear. I'd be a little bit more comfortable with it.
It's just it makes like a 7/7. Like
yeah. I mean, I actually played a game in an Arena Cube some number of months ago where I was playing like a black-white sacrifice kind of aggro-y deck, and my opponent was on this like big green deck, and I sideboarded it in, and there was a game where they got really far ahead of me. They had like several giant creatures on board. They were waiting to do a big alpha attack because I had like a variety of like small junk on the battlefield that was never going to win the game in a fair fight, but like could block and trigger my Blood Artists. So they slow rolled it a little bit to try to just like over muscle me on board. And I'm not exaggerating. I Sunfalled and made a fucking 12/12, and then attacked the next turn and just won in one swing because of the Blood Artist triggers I had already put on board. So yeah, Sunfall is Sunfall. I actually saw a comment on some, I think it was a constructed Reddit subforum, recently where somebody was like celebrating that like Sunfall was finally going to rotate because apparently it was really brutal and constructed too. Yeah. And then
still standard legal, yeah.
Yeah, that didn't happen. But a couple more notes I wanted to make on why Wraths are kind of falling. And I still think they're playable for the record. Like if I'm playing a control deck, I'll still like put 2, but I don't want 4. There's a couple of reasons. There are the classic problems that Wraths already had on top of the stuff that Teld and Tim just mentioned, which is if I'm playing a proactive deck and I go 1-drop and then I play a 2-drop and you have open mana and you don't Doomblade it or counter it, I smell a Wrath. Like you're trying to get maximum value out of your Wrath, right? And it can be pretty obvious. And then sometimes if like I just don't make a turn 3 play and you're holding up a counter spell or whatever, you're still like not incentivized to like snap off your Doomblade to take care of my 2-drop because you're trying to clean it up with your Wrath and get like card advantage off of that. And so, like, Wraths can still be played around. And then the other element is, card advantage. Like, these days, as we mentioned, there's card advantage in basically every single color. And I think one of the strengths of Wraths used to be that, like, 2-for-1ing your opponent, like, even if you're just cleaning up 2 creatures with your Wrath, like, that used to feel like, okay, I'm up a card. Like, I'm 1 more card towards my plan of having resources when you don't. But when proactive decks generate card advantage, they can shrug off that 2-for-1 and still grind into the later game with you. So Wraths are not the like, I mean, don't get me wrong. The reason that we still play some 4-mana Wraths is there are still situations where I'm like, okay, I Wrath, like you're playing a proactive deck, you get Wrath and you're like, just like, fuck, that's the game. Like that still happens. But there are a lot more ways for proactive decks to play around them and then also like recover from them. As Wraths become easier to recover from, like we said at the top of the episode, like a lot of these observations are based on kind of the natural evolution of how we've been seeing our players build control decks. I'm sure like anybody likes to think their play group is good, but I mean, our play group is a high skill play group, and that's just kind of the direction that they're heading in. Not to mention the fact that as we've talked about, control decks are starting to play more of these like 3-drop creatures that are really powerful on board. If you're holding one of them in your hand and you're holding a Wrath, it's just really awkward, right? Because you want to get that Seed Shark on board. Well, Seed Shark's a bad example because it's actually a really fun card to follow up with a Wrath. But, you know, if I want to play my like Sphalen on turn 3 or my Spellbinder to poke your hand on turn 3, like I don't really want to Wrath it off the board, you know? So I think Wraths still have a place in Cube, but they don't clean up like if your opponent, like if you're holding up a Wrath and your opponent's like turn 3 play is like a proactive Planeswalker, that sucks. If you hold up a Wrath and your opponent plays like an Engine-y enchantment or artifact, that sucks. If you're playing against a black deck with like a recursive creature on board that's beating you to death and a Blood Artist, that sucks. The Wrath effect is a very old effect that's balanced around what boards used to look like. And since those like Wrath of God effects haven't like evolved with how the game is playing, I still think they have a place in your control decks, but they're not the cards that are winning you the game as much as they used to be. So as Teld mentioned, you know, I mentioned earlier, like trying to 1-for-1 your opponent is a losing game plan, but it's a losing game plan if that's all you're doing. A 1-for-1 removal plan gets a lot better when you have something also going on board. Think of it this way. I think the old control style was if you like relate it to boxing. You're just guarding up, you're just letting your opponent throw punches until they get too tired to play defense, and then you just hit them once and they drop. Now, if you try to play that style, your opponent is throwing harder, faster punches, and they're going to get 1 or 2 devastating hits in before they run out of gas, if that makes any sense. It's not really a viable game plan anymore to just turtle up and wait for them to run out of steam.
Yeah. So one thing too that I don't think people consider when you put a Wrath in your deck, and you know, obviously putting a Wrath in your deck gives you the option of having the Wrath, right? You can have spots where your opponent has to respect it. But the flip side of that is that when you look at your opening hand and it has a Wrath in it, you now kind of have to play to that because that Wrath is not something else. There's the opportunity cost of having the Wrath. And so, especially like you mentioned, if you're playing creatures, you don't really want to do that. But also, that's just, that Wrath could have been another interactive spell that would have allowed you to play that more 1-for-1 slower game. And especially when your opponent is spending all of their mana every turn, like we mentioned the Cryptic Code example, or the Stoic Sphinx example, right? You have to hit them 4 times or 7 times or however many. But if your opponent spends all of their mana every turn playing their 4-drop or their 5-drop, and you spend 2 mana countering it and you deploy another threat, like, how many times do you need to do that before they die? Right? Because in this case, in this kind of hypothetical, every time we use a counter spell, we're generally time walking our opponent, right? We're keeping them from progressing their game plan. And so our fast clock or mid-speed clock is getting closer towards killing them. So it actually is even in our benefit to have these 1-for-1 spells take up an entire turn cycle each, because each one puts us closer to actually just killing our opponent with the threat we put into play.
Yeah. I guess one more thing, and I know I keep saying one more thing to toss in on Wraths, is like, and I'm sure we've all experienced this, if you have a Wrath in your opener and you're playing against like an aggro deck, you're often going to kind of warp the way that you approach the game in the early game to try to get maximum value out of your Wrath and hold as many cards as you can. But when you commit to that, and you often do commit to that if you have a Wrath in your hand, because if you don't commit to that plan, then you make the Wrath bad, right? So you commit to the Wrath plan, but then if your opponent does a series of things that make the Wrath not good, you still feel like compelled to snap the Wrath off, because why did you sacrifice tempo early if you're not going to Wrath? So it presents this conundrum where it's like, okay, I need to play to making the Wrath good, and then if the Wrath isn't good, I feel like I still have to do it, because otherwise, like, what the fuck did I do all that for? And then if you don't commit to that plan, then you have this Wrath sitting in your hand that might be useful for like a rebuild later, because like your opponent maybe has one big rebuild in them, so maybe it doesn't suck that bad later, but it still doesn't feel good to make the Wrath in your hand not ideal when it's supposed to be. So they just have a lot working against them now compared to old school.
There's also the final component to all of this, I think, which is that we didn't really talk about the 2-drops, but blue decks are playing more 2-drops, and in our environment, we've noticed all of the 2-drops pretty much are looters. And one of the things that does is when you play these 2-drops, when you manage to slip them in and they sculpt your draw, they still have to sit in play. So if you Wrath, you're now putting yourself into a higher variance situation. Because 1, you tapped out, let your opponent get the window that we've talked about. But 2, you don't get to sit there and hit your opponent every turn with Malcolm. You don't get to sit there and loot every time your Duelist to the Mind triggers, right? Every time you interact with your opponent. And so you increase the likelihood that you get into the, I used to joke on my, when I would stream about how my control opponent would just draw 3 lands and die, right? And it'd be like, they would interact with me a bunch of times, and then they would draw 3 lands in a row and just die. And that doesn't really happen as often anymore, because we have so many looters in the cube and so many ways to sculpt your draws. But if you can't have those creatures sit in play because you're trying to set up a Wrath so you didn't put them in your deck, you don't get that advantage. So just all of these little utility creatures end up playing a bigger game plan. They also trade. Like, it's better to have your Fairy Mastermind sit in play or your Malcolm sit in play and be able to trade with your opponent's 2-drop in some spots.
Dude, if you have to Wrath your own creature, like,
yeah, it feels bad.
That's just game. That's just, you just paid 4 mana for Bone Splinters, like,
right.
You just can't do that. You you can't Wrath your own creature. So like a lot of your blue decks, we're talking about how they're focusing a lot more on early game creature finishers. Like, they just don't gel with Wraths too much. Like, it's almost to the point where Wraths are the sideboard plan rather than something you actually put in your main board.
Yeah, I agree. They're also notably terrible against the black sack decks. Like, they're really
bad they have bad
matchups
artists too. Like, they have terrible, like, if you're control versus control, it's just a dead card a lot of the time. Like,
really bad against mono red as well. Funny enough, you would think they would be good against mono red, but most iterations of mono red are playing like,
it's good against Selesnya. Yeah, Wraths are good against Selesnya.
various green decks, Wraths are very good,
which can hate draft the Wraths from you.
But yeah, do you want to spend 4 mana and burn a card so that you can kill your opponent's, checks notes, Kamano and Monastery Swiftspear? Like,
right.
I will kill my opponent's 2 1-drops.
Yeah, and then
they'll play another
animate.
hasty.
They animate their lair or their goblin land and hit you for 4 or whatever.
Yeah, they're not good against creature lands either. The way that I would synthesize all of this before we move on is, I think in today's day and age, Wraths still have the classic 4 mana Wraths still have a place. Like, obviously Sunfall ridiculously has a place in any cube that's comfortable playing
for Sunfall, ignore everything we've said. It's it's one of the best cards in the Timeless cube. Like, you put that card in a cube and it's going to be a top 10 card.
The way I would synthesize all of this as it relates to like Day of Judgment and Wrath of God is, think of your Wraths more as bullets than game plans. They don't make good game plans anymore. They still work fine as bullets for when you find yourself in a losing position.
You know what I think would be a nice push for a Wrath in an upcoming set would be a 4 mana. Like, it would be strictly better than Wrath of God, but I think we're, 30 years into Magic, we could probably do that. I think a Wrath that also snagged tokens would be nice. Like, just clear the board of the stupid treasure and clues and whatnot. Maybe that's too good. I don't know, but that seems to be an issue with Wrath, is like your opponent just has like a couple blood tokens, a treasure token, a clue token floating around. Like, they're just going to recoup the loss from the Wrath. So maybe 4 mana Wrath also snag tokens would be something I'd want to see pushing Wrath territory without maybe being too good.
Tim using his WotC insider information to spoil us.
Look, if this comes out next set, if this happens next set, I'm gonna be irate. Let's just put it that way. You've got one more big segment you want to transition into here, Chris?
Yeah, so let's try. I want to synthesize all of this into what I would call sort of like the new control plan. I would characterize the new control plan that we've seen emerge, that I think is more in step with the way Magic plays now than the old plan. I would characterize it as big tempo. The old plan is kind of like interact, yada, 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 finish. And we've discussed the reasons that we think that is not as effective as it used to be. The new plan is like interact, pick a spot, interact, close. Mm-hmm. So you're trying to pick a spot faster and then stay on top of the game after you've picked your spot. And that's how you're trying to close, which is a lot closer to like a tempo/aggro control deck that it used to be. It's like a mid-range control deck. It's like an aggro control deck that's going bigger.
Yeah, I think I agree with this, and I think one of the advantages here too is that this is both more fun to play. These decks are much more fun to pilot than the traditional control decks that leave you feeling kind of hopeless in some spots. Mm-hmm. And two, they're more fun to play against because your opponent isn't playing against a completely alien game plan that none of their removal spells work. Like, one of the cool things about this trend that we're seeing is that your opponent's removal spells actually work now. Your opponent is less likely to have like 3 dead cards in their hand against control. I noticed this like a few weeks ago. I was playing a mono red deck. I played against a control opponent and I was like, man, I just opened like 4 removal spells and no creatures. I'm probably going to lose. But what ended up happening is my opponent was playing these cheap creatures. I killed his cheap creatures, and then we got into an extended game, and I like drew a Hazoret or something and was able to play this. So like basically, instead of being an auto lose because my handful of like 3 cheap burn spells wouldn't have done anything, I got to use those to trade for my opponent's creatures. We played a full game of Magic, and I managed to squeeze it out. And like, that is a lot more enjoyable than your opponent playing a completely different. The traditional control game plan is so devoid and detached from traditional Magic gameplay. And I know this is probably contentious, but it is, right? It's like combo and control are just not playing in the same range as aggro and mid-range. Because these decks now play to the board, there's a lot more jockeying, there's a lot more decisions you have to make. It's a lot less binary in terms of what the gameplay looks like.
Yeah, and the flip side of that too, and I think that this is like a minor advantage to your control decks as well, is once upon a time, I think like the heuristic was, okay, I had played against a control deck, so I'm going to board out like all of my removal and just stuff my deck full of threats, which the control deck, unless in the draft they got more removal than they needed, so they can just stuff their deck full of more removal to counter, which sometimes you couldn't do, right, because you were already playing all your removal. Your opponent can't just like, okay, these slightly weaker threats that didn't make my main, I'm just gonna shove them in here now and cut all my Doom Blades. Like, I did that once early in this like control evolution because I hadn't adjusted to it, and I took out all my Doom Blades, and then my control opponent just like stuck stuff that was problematic, and I had like no way to get rid of it. So as the control player, I think this gives you another edge where like it makes it harder for your proactive opponent to just like adjust to what you're doing and just overload your interaction.
Again, it's a lot more like thoughtful decision making. It's a lot less heuristic based. This is, I'm against this opponent, so I have to sideboard in this way. And I will say that this is one of the areas where we need to give WotC credit. We've complained about power creep and things, but I will say cards are a lot more dynamic and interesting these days, right? There's a lot more,
100%, yeah.
A lot of decisions you have to make that are not just, okay, my opponent is playing aggro, therefore I cut these cards, bring in these cards. It's like, my opponent had this specific card, so I need to adjust so that I can beat this specific card that my deck otherwise can't beat. So it's just generally speaking, a lot more engaging and dynamic decision making in terms of sideboarding as opposed to heuristic based, which I think is probably healthy for the game.
Definitely, especially with the control decks like playing more proactive threats in like the mid cost range is, I referred to it earlier as picking a spot. And if your control plan previously was, I'm just going to interact until I draw my finisher, like that's, you're committed to doing that. That's what your deck does. And if you have options to quote unquote like pick a spot in the middle of the game, like that's a decision that you have to. And don't get me wrong, it's not like you just play a 3-drop as a control deck and untap and win the game, right? If you play your 3-drop and your opponent does something and you're like, ah, shit, like that happens. Mm-hmm. So there's a gameplay decision to be made, a skill testing decision to be made of like, if I am going to try to flip the table before turn 6, like when is the spot where it's safe for me to do that. It just makes the control games more interesting.
And if you enjoy that traditional style of control, I'm pretty sure you can still make it work. You know, you can load your deck full of like, I think Wraths are just generically kind of awkward, even if you're not playing to what we're talking about. But, you know, we've seen people before where you load your deck full of spot removal, then you play an Intrude on the Mind, you draw like 3 or 4 cards, and then you play a Gear Hulk, you draw a bunch more cards. And so like you can do these sort of things. You have to be a lot more cognizant of everything, but most of what we're seeing is like control decks playing minimum like 7-8 creatures. You know, using them to take advantage of the fact that creatures are good. Did you know if Malcolm sits in play for 4 turns, it starts generating free value instead of just looting?
Yeah, it does.
A couple notes here. One thing, you mentioned Intrude on the Mind just now, which is a very important card to bring up. Whether that makes it into like your vintage cubes or whatever, I don't know. But speaking of giving Wizards, credit where credit is due, since I'm on payroll, obviously, there has been an uptick in traditional effects that are also affecting the board now, which Intrude on the Mind is a great example of, like, the factor fiction-y type spell. Sure, you're overpaying for the factor fiction, but you're getting a body on board. So you don't have to just do that whole like 4-mana draw spell. Oops, my opponent made me counter something, so I don't get to cast my draw spell. You get to actually affect the board while drawing cards. Other recent examples include Saruman's Trickery, which is the cancel variant that amasses 1. And then there's also Hopeender Quaddle from Modern Horizons, which is the 3-mana 2/2 flash force spike, counter something unless you pay 1. And boy, did I get an earful for that one when I played last week. But these are just like traditional effects. Normally you have a counter spell in your hand and you have a draw spell, and you just have to choose which one to cast. But now you can actually start affecting the board. It's not every card that does it, right? Like, we don't have a lot of draw spells that affect the board. But cards like Intrude on the Mind, all within like the last year or so, I think Lord of the Rings was the first one to really give us effects like this that we wanted. These let you start affecting the board now while doing the traditional control things of drawing cards and countering spells and stuff like that. 2 other things I want to mention. First off, I want to give a lot of credit to the card Stern Scolding, specifically, which is the 1 blue Lord of the Rings card that counters a creature with power or toughness 2 or less. Is that right?
It scolds to Plowshare, yeah.
Yeah, sure. The blue swords to Plowshares. I think that card is like pivotal, and we don't even play it anymore because people complained a lot and
found it
for
frustrating.
Good reason.
Yeah,
it's a frustrating card, but man, that card contributes so much to being able to squeeze in like these 3 drops on turn 4 or these 2 drops on turn 3 and stuff like that, and still have interaction up. It's almost like, I mean, Spell Pierce is like a tried and true classic, and Spell Pierce is like. The lower curves get, the better Spell Pierce gets, basically, and Stern Scolding kind of plays into that similar space. And then last thing I wanted to mention here, Chris, I noticed when you're talking about traditional control versus new control, you didn't bring up 4-mana draw 2s at all, like, which is, the old paradigm used to be like, I would have my cancel variant in my hand alongside with my 4-mana draw 2. And if I didn't have to counter something, I would just fire off this 2-for-1 for 4 mana. Like, why? I know why. I'm playing devil's advocate. Why do we not sculpt out a section to talk about like these big draw spells?
I think what you're seeing with the 4-mana draw 2s in general is, well, first of all, we mentioned Stoic Sphinx earlier. I think 95% of the time I want to be playing like a 5/3 hexproof flyer instead of drawing 2 cards. But I think the big weakness is, like, just like we talk about, Wraths don't generate card advantage the way that they used to, is if all of the decks that you're playing against in every color have ways of generating resources, like, you going up a card is not the game plan that it used to be. Like, pure card advantage as blue is not going to be eventually game winning the way that it used to be.
Sure. So it's like blue. You're spending turn 4 to go up a card, whereas your opponent curved Sharp-Eyed Rookie into Tireless Tracker, and is going to draw like way more cards than you throughout the course of the game while they're also attacking you.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's one of the problems, like we mentioned it a long time ago in the blue episode. That was one of the issues that we were having is like, why does blue not feel amazing against green anymore? And we realized it was because green was drawing a lot of cards. If your opponent goes like, in their green deck, if they go like Dork 3-drop and then you Wrath, like they could just next turn they can just drop Radagast and start drawing cards again, and then like your Wrath just wasn't the card that you wanted it to be.
Yeah, blue card. It's not. I mean, what do we play? Like maybe 1 4-mana draw 2 or something like that in our cube.
Are we back on Deluge or?
We are currently on Deluge, though. I don't recall seeing that card in any of the lists that we're doing.
Yeah, we also have Deduce.
Yeah, Deduce too. Yeah, I mean they have a role, like, but Deduce is like exactly what I want that to look like. These also have like extra utility on top of being just 4-mana draw 2s. Like,
well, yeah, I mean I think the best 4-mana draw 2 there is probably Dismiss. I mean maybe draw 2 isn't exactly accurate, but like instead of having to choose between playing my draw spell or playing my counter spell, I will just do both for 4-mana. And that card's actually, to give Chris his credit, on this episode, is like that was a Chris suggestion of like how can we let blue get some card advantage while also countering stuff, and that card actually just ends up looking like Cryptic Command often enough.
A lot.
Exclude is in that conversation as well, the 3-mana counter creature draw card.
Yeah, we actually cut that because it was basically dismiss against creature decks for 1 less mana, and as blue negotiated itself from worst color to very competitive, like maybe in the top 2 colors, it just became kind of unacceptable for 3-mana dismiss to exist.
Yeah, it was also just part of a package of we cut down on the amount of counter magic in general, because counter magic, it was very common to just kind of get locked out, so to speak, where your opponent would just like counter a thing and then they would kill your creature that didn't have a good ETB, and they'd counter your next thing, they'd counter your next thing, they'd sublime you, they Torrential Garruk sublime you, and it was just this never-ending string of counter magic. So we actually went down a little on that, so to give decks that had ETBs a little bit of breathing room. There's still plenty of interaction in the cube. We just kind of moved it around a little bit so that blue wasn't playing just a wall of counter magic.
So the overarching theme here is control is very much alive and well. It looks different. It plays to the board a lot more. It's a little more creature heavy than traditional control decks used to look.
Yeah, and just like I guess my last comment is, you might listen to this episode and think, well, maybe this comes down more to the construction of your cube than it does to mine. And I say fair enough, if you have like a specific goal in mind. But I do think that a lot of cubes are designed along similar lines as ours, which is to say fair magic that's playing a lot of them, like the most powerful fair cards that you can play. And so even though your cube is obviously not our cube, I do think that these lessons, which are borne out by natural evolution and play testing and just repeated iterations by very skilled players, I think that, assuming it's not like a combo cube or something like that, I think you'll probably find that a lot of this stuff ends up adapting very well to your own environment, or we wouldn't have spent the time to do the episode.
Yeah, a lot of this is not we have made design decisions and forced our players to draft a certain way. It's more like the cube was a certain way. Players started adapting to make a color work inside that environment or make a strategy work inside that environment, and we have noticed. This is mostly a really organic player-driven thing, and it's a bunch of different things that a bunch of different players in the community, like I've been talking about Wraths being mid for a while, and we've been talking about 3-drops being snowbally, and all of these things kind of coalesce into this is what control looks like now from a bunch of different people. So it's really organic. So this isn't really just we sculpted our cube to make sure that traditional control was bad or something.
I'm scrolling through the the current vintage cube list right now, just to kind of like get an idea of like where it's at, because I don't really keep up with the changes that happen to the vintage cube regularly. But I mean, they're on Duelist of the Mind, they're on Ledger Shredder, they're on Kitsa, they're on Malcolm. Like they've got this kind of thing going on. They've got True Name Nemesis. Like blue can definitely kind of play the early game here. Like they're not on Svalin, but obviously they have
I think that one's kind of a sleeper.
Seed Shark, For sure, for sure. I mean, Chrome Host Seed Shark, even Kite Sail Larcenist is in here, which is a fine card. There's a lot going on in blue that's very similar to what we're seeing in our own cube, and you don't see Torrential Gearhulk or anything like that in fact, I don't think I see a single flash threat or like traditional control finisher in blue in the vintage cube that costs more than 5 mana. Like, I'm not seeing anything like that here. There's Smirking Spelljacker, which is a hell of a card, but
never heard of that one.
Yeah, here, I'm going to read this one to you.
This must be a direct to commander.
This was a commander card, but it's fair game for vintage. So 4 in a blue, 3/3, flash and flying. So 5 mana, 3/3, flash flyer. When it enters the battlefield, exile target spell an opponent controls. So it kind of like spell quellers anything. When it attacks, you can cast the spell without paying its mana cost.
Excuse me?
God.
Wait. Hold on.
You spell queller a card off the stack, and then you just cast it for free when this thing attacks.
Is it the first time it attacks, or is it every time it attacks?
Oh, it pulls the card out of exile and casts the spell, so it doesn't have anything exiled anymore.
Okay,
presumably.
the way you said that, I was thinking that you could put a time warp on it and then just copy it every single turn. Yeah.
No, but really, I mean, silly. talk about a 5-drop control finisher like that. That's a hell of a card right there. But yeah, the point being, like, I don't see. There's no Shark Typhoon in here. There's no Sublime Epiphany. There's no Torrential Gearhulk, which we like those cards, and a lot of those cards are fun to play. But you see Vintage Cube moving away from stuff like that, like in favor of a lot of the same stuff we see our Cube moving in favor of. So
I did want to say one more thing. I lied, and this is actually like kind of out of place. I should have talked about it earlier in the episode. But I wanted to plug a Teld suggestion that I was extremely skeptical of and have since come to really respect. Speaking of like expensive blue cards that are still good, Horned Lockwhale, it turns out, is actually just pretty good. Horned Lockwhale is 6 mana for a 6/6 flash with Ward 2, and unless it's your turn, it enters the battlefield tapped. So that doesn't sound very good, right? Like, I don't know that I would want to play that card, but it is a 6/6 with Ward 2, so it's going to get there. But, you read that line, it enters tapped. It's actually, the art's a little misleading because it shows this thing, like, flashing out of the water to eat a griffin, but it enters the battlefield tapped, so, like, from a flavor perspective, it can't actually do that. But what makes this card really, really great is Lagoon Breach, which is an adventure that's attached to it. It's 1 in a blue. The owner of target attacking creature you don't control puts it on the top or bottom of their library, which is a hell of a lot better than Bounce for obvious reasons, because this is not card disadvantage. In fact, this is ultimately, in terms of draws, card advantage, right? Because you basically do that and draw the whale. And what really made me a believer, and then Teld, I'm sure, has a couple notes on it because it's his card, is I played this card in one of my decks, and my opponent attacked me with their 2-drop, and I did the adventure, and my opponent thought about it for 30 seconds. It was such a long time, but they put it on the bottom of their library. I guess they were like, there's better plays in my hand coming up, and I want to see another card, maybe I need another land. And when they put it on the bottom of their library, that's Doomblade.
Doomblade that drew you a 6/6.
Yeah, that's Doomblade. So yeah, if you're looking for another blue finisher, you have one that you feel is underperforming. This card might not read much, but it's good.
Yeah, actually, we were talking about it, and look at us, all patting each other on the back for good suggestions we've made.
I know that's been the episode.
It's been the energy. Yeah, yes, gentlemen, good, excellent selection.
my esteemed colleague.
All right, yeah. So if you would like to try Horned Lockwhale out before I talk about it, 4 cents. So it'll really run you up on the old TCG counter.
4 cents. Oh, we're at 79 cents. All right, let's go.
Yeah, no, your local game store might just give it to you to reduce the number of cards they have to
organize. You can build a whole cube for $1.
Yeah. So a couple of things about Horned Lockwhale. I mean, firstly, the 2 mana adventure just ends up most of the time being a Doomblade. Even if your opponent puts back on top, this is the classic conundrum with blue removal of well, it didn't actually get rid of my opponent's card, but it's still 1-for-1 them, right? Sure, they redraw their threat. You have to eventually find a long-term solution, but it still stifles their draw step. And like Chris mentioned, a lot of times whether it's because their hand, the way it plays out, or because they don't have land drops, they can't put it back on top. If your opponent's stumbling on lands, they might want that 2-drop to recast, but they have to try to hit their land drop, so they have to put it on bottom. So it's just a really cheap, just really cheap spell that is a really good defensive spell that then, you would think a 6 mana 6/6 Ward 2 with flash that is a really crappy flash creature would be bad. But we've talked before. We talked on an episode of the Peasant Cube about how this just doesn't matter. if you're in a spot where you can afford to, like, you're big fishing your opponent, no pun intended, I guess. Whales are mammals, so that's not a pun. Anyways, you could just like you could just run this out, right? If you need the blocker, just play it. It's going to take your opponent's entire turn to kill it. And then if they don't, you get to the end step and you just flash it in, right? So it's an innate 2-for-1 that's very tempo positive. And the body looks unimpressive, but your opponent's going to have to actually spend quite a bit of mana to deal with it. Probably going to have to spend minimum 4 mana, but sometimes they're just not going to be able to effectively deal with it. Just a really, really rock solid card that to me has become one of the big signals that, like, if you pass this card, just know, like, if you pass this card and I'm in your pod and it makes it to me, I'm probably assuming blue is open. Because you shouldn't be passing it. It's a very, very high pick in blue card. You should treat it as a high pick in our environment.
Art's cool. Also,
pivotally, I think it's huge on this card. It can the adventure can target creature lands that are attacking you, and blue traditionally does not have a good answer for something like a Lair of the Hydra coming your way.
Good point.
So, like, not only does it deal with the creature land, but it also just strip mines your opponent when you do that. So, like, that just gives blue an extra little layer of interaction that it doesn't have otherwise. Like, I can't think of another blue card in our cube that removes a creature land at instant speed, because things like Brazen Borrower and Unsummon and stuff don't do that.
The chair recognizes the senator from Washington.
Yeah, you could. You could repulse it. You could repulse, but this is a good bit better than repulse because it has a 6/6 staple to it.
Sure, yeah. Any other final thoughts here on Control's role in the modern day Cuban space?
I don't think so. We should probably cut it off there unless Teld's got something burning to say. But
just that the cards have changed. The game plan has slightly changed, but it's still doing what it does best, which is punishing your opponent for playing greedy mid-range decks with way too many 4 and 5 drops.
Yep.
All right. Well, let's wrap this bad boy up. Remember, you can find us on our social medias, Twitter at JankDiverGaming, YouTube.com/JankDiverGaming, and when Teld is not running across the country, Twitch.tv/TeldTalks, TELD Talks. We'll have some more episodes before Duskmorn comes out. By the time we record the next episode, we'll actually be mid-Duskmorn preview season. So I think...
Oh, shit. Yeah.
I think what's going to happen is we'll have another episode in 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks from then, we'll probably have our Duskmorn review.
You should definitely get on the server before then, because the spoilers channel lights up like a fucking Christmas tree. There's a lot. It's not uncommon for me to hop on and like click on the channel, and it's like, there have been 125 messages since 30 minutes ago.
Yeah, my favorite thing is when I wake up at 9 p.m. and I see a cool card, and I'm like, check the guys out, and they're like, oh, we talked about that 2 hours ago. Like, just scroll up, and I'm like, damn it, okay.
Yeah, it's the highlight of the server. It's just like we're all just looking, refreshing Magic spoilers over there. It's great.
We'll see what our next episode's going to be between now and then, but I would anticipate Duskmorn preview in 2 episodes from now. That's going to go ahead and do it for this one. Thanks for hanging out. Thanks for talking about Control, and remember, play around those wraths. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time. I actually wanted to talk about something briefly. I wanted to talk about a game that I know Teld has played, but I don't know that Chris has played. I'm not sure if it's even your speed, Chris, but I played a little game called Tunic recently, which was kind of recommended via the Discord. I'm in the stage of my life where I can't really play like a expansive open world game because of my commitment to kiddo and like my energy level between work and everything. So like, I'm just not in the mood to play like an Elden Ring-esque game or anything like that. But Tunic was suggested by, I think, like maybe Mop Beeble, one other person, and I think Teld played it and gave it really high marks. So I was like, okay, let me check this out. It was free on Game Pass for Xbox, so like easy steal there. It's a Zelda-esque, like it's kind of mixing, like it's advertising itself as like Zelda meets Dark Souls. It's not as like challenging. It's not a challenging game at all. It's not a hard game, but it's got kind of like Souls-like vibes on top of an overworld that's very reminiscent of Zelda. And I guess I should say to anybody who's listening who might even like consider playing this game, it's one of those games you can't really talk about without spoiling like something really huge about it. So if this is something that like you might be interested in or that sounds appealing, I would probably just stop listening here.
I play a lot of games, and this was one of those games that instantly went on my top 25 list. I highly recommend, if you haven't played Tunic and think that you like the Zelda, or if you like that Zelda formula at all, just go play it and then like maybe come back to this, because Yeah, we're probably about to spoil some of it, but it is a truly, truly fantastic game. So just go play it.
Yeah.
All right, spoilers warned.
Yep, the spoiler warning. So like you can beat this game in like 10 hours, maybe even less than that. You get you get a sword. That's your one weapon for the game. Like the combat's not deep. And when we say spoiler warning, like it's not story spoilers. It's kind of like discovery spoilers because the whole point of the game is to find hidden stuff. Mm-hmm. And I'm just gonna share the thing that like I haven't had a good like blow your mind moment in video gaming in a while, and this was like the first time I've had one in a while. But the way the game is structured is they don't tell you how to play the game. Like there's no like tutorial. What you do is as you're exploring, you'll find pieces of a manual. Kind of like it's styled like an old, you know how you used to open like a PS2 game or a PS1 game and they would have the gaming manual and you flip through, it's got like art and stuff and like controls. You find pages of a manual in the game. And they're loaded with like secrets and stuff like that. They kind of like tell you, oh, if you press these buttons, you can do these things, or if you use this item in this spot, certain things will happen. But at one point in the game, like at the midpoint level, you find a page that tells you if you hold down a certain button for 3 seconds, like things will happen around you, and it unlocks like so much of the game. Like you could just get to start exploring and fast traveling and everything. But the thing that blows my mind about it is that you could just do that from the very beginning of the game. Like that is just like you don't unlock that. That's just something that you had from the very start of the game. And you have to kind of discover that you can do it. But on a subsequent playthrough, you could just start like fast traveling from the very start of the game, which I think is like very, very cool design because like these designers really tried to put like a speed running experience in the game for people who wanted to do that. And like the tools are there to do it. You just have to find out that you can do it.
Did you beat it?
Yeah, I 100% it, unlocked all the achievements. Cool. I got to the point where I started looking up the answers to puzzles because I was like, I know what the answer to this puzzle is, but I don't want to spend the 30 minutes to figure it out.
Yeah, that was what I started doing is I would kind of like get to a puzzle and then I'd be like, okay, I understand what I need to do, but I just don't feel like spending the 30 minutes to actually, figure this out. And I will say the Holy Cross thing was a huge, that was a big mind blow moment of like, oh my God, especially, and the biggest for me was I kind of spoiled Mott by accident because the way he was talking, I assumed he had beaten it. But when you're looking through you're finding the pieces of the manual and you've been trying to rescue the trapped prisoner, right? This whole time. And you find that piece of the manual that I think it's like the first page and it's like a battle that has repeated itself through time. And you,
it's like, oh, that's a bad guy.
Yeah, and you realize this whole time you've been like kind of bamboozled. I mean, that game had multiple mind blow moments. I thought the actual true ending was super cute. Just very, very good game. Like truly just like it wasn't, I think it's a proof. I've talked before a little bit with people about how like I don't think games need necessarily to be the most fancy graphics or even the craziest gameplay to be really good. It was just a good example of them taking an idea and a concept and a plan and really executing it in a great way. And I wish gaming would do that more, where they would just really focus on what it is that they want their game experience to be and not what the other people might want their experience to be, or, needing the best graphics. It was just a really expertly crafted game from top to bottom, and I really enjoyed it, despite the fact that it was fairly easy.
It's sweet. Yeah, you mentioned the Grand Cross thing, which just like that thing where you learn that you can hold down the A button or whatever for 3 seconds, you get another page later on that shows you that there's this Grand Cross thing you can do where if you enter I was playing on console, so it's the D-pad. I'm assuming you played on like PC where it's like a certain keyboard
I use a controller.
Okay, so there's a D-pad input that's like 6 or 7 buttons where if you press it in a certain order, it'll show you like secrets nearby and stuff like that. But also they're like, as you're playing the game, they're just random patterns all over these walls and these doors and stuff like that, and they just look kind of like flavor text, like, oh, here's a here's a portrait up on the wall and stuff, but every single one of them is actually a code that you can enter on the D-pad. Like if you follow the path of like the puzzle or the path of the maze or the path of the image on the wall or the floor or whatever, like it'll unlock something like pretty much every time. And there are tons of them. Like there's one that's like the flowers, like this normal spot that you walk over and over and over again in the game has like 6 or 7 flowers that are actually arranged in a pattern where you can press like the D-pad input in that pattern and unlock an item or whatever. And it's just like tons of that. Like it's a really dense world that's all packed in with all these secrets and stuff. And I will say like some of it's too dense. Some of it's more like, I get it if you're really, really into the puzzle solving aspect, like it's cool, but some of them are kind of like, okay, I get what you're doing here, but just tell me the solution, you know? But yeah, it's just super cool to discover those things, because I think Chris even mentioned it on an episode not too long ago when we were talking about video games. Maybe it was off air, but like video games are so hand-holdy these days that like you don't get those discovery moments that much. And like this was the first time in a very long time where I felt like I was discovering things without the game being like spoon feeding it to me, you know?
Yeah, it reminded that was the sort of Souls element of it that I felt more than anything. I mean, sure, there's a stamina meter and stuff, but like I felt like the real Souls element of that game was here's a world, like go, I don't know, dude, go explore. You'll figure out what to do.
Yeah. So bottom line, I think the game is like generally like $20. So if you buy Tunic, Quintorius Loremaster, Hornlock Whale, and Stoic Sphinx, you probably spent a good $20.75 on this episode, which feels like we're doing our due diligence.
You know, we're not sponsored by Tunic, but hey, people who made Tunic, if you're listening.
Yes, and I will give you a much better enthusiastic ad read than I would for HelloFresh. Let's just put it that way. Well, the sponsorship with HelloFresh fell through for undisclosed reasons, but we've been sponsored by the next best thing, Hola Fresco. Hola Fresco is an up-and-coming meal delivery service made for the busy common folk like us, and we're excited to partner with them to bring you a revolutionary culinary experience. Indulge in delectable favorites such as chicken and peas, plain spaghetti, toasted bean sprouts, and what Hola Fresco refers to as their El Diablo sandwich. Each meal comes packed, and they have calories. Meal delivery fees are bleeding our American wallets dry, but we're proud to announce that Hola Fresco is more affordable than a playset of etched foil alternate art Strixhaven Mystical Archive framed Quintorius Loremasters. Each meal averages around just $5.99 with a $129.99 delivery fee, but you can even waive the delivery fee by picking up your meals in person from our trust expert Raymond, stationed in the back alley of a Costco near you. There's no reason you and your family should starve tonight just because you suck at cooking. Let our culinary masters deal with dinner while you kick up your feet and relax. Use promo code FOOTRUBFETISH for 35 cents off your first order. And if you don't like your very first meal, we encourage you to try a second one. Thanks for shopping with Hola Fresco, where we've been putting our meat in your mouth for 25 years.